Hello and welcome. Looks like we still got a few people logging in, so we'll give it just another minute or so and then we'll get started. Good afternoon and welcome to this National Bleeding Disorders Foundation Wednesday webinar. My name is Fiona Robinson and I will be your host today. Today, we are going to learn about the importance of participating in research. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available shortly after it ends on the NBDF website bleeding.org. We encourage you to ask any questions you may have today. You can ask your question by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen at any time. We'll keep an eye on those questions as they come in, and once the speakers have finished their presentation, we'll put your questions to them. Today, we are joined by Matt Hartnett, Senior Community Research Network Manager at the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation, and by Paxton Mills, a lived experience expert studying biochemistry and molecular biology, a member of the NBDF National Youth Leadership Institute, and a youth representative on the NBDF Board of Directors. I'd like to thank Matt and Paxton for joining us today, and I'll turn things over now to Matt to get us started.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Hartnett. I'm going to be one of your two presenters today, and we're just going to go through a few things, but mainly what we're trying to talk about today is how you can use your voice in the community and how your voice and your experience can help shape research. So really quick, what we're going to go over, just kind of lay of the land. So what we're going to do initially is just identify the issue. So we're going to talk about what is missing from modern research. Then we'll talk about why it's important, why sharing your experience is so important. And then we'll talk about how you can help. And so we'll show mainly integral way to participate in research that I think is monumental, but we'll also talk about a few other ways. So just a reminder, I think everyone here knows this, but NBDF is dedicated to finding cures for inheritable blood and bleeding disorders and to addressing and preventing complications of these disorders. And so we do that through a handful of different ways: research, education, advocacy, etc. Today, we'll obviously be focusing on the research initiative. We are no longer NHF, we are now NBDF. Our hope is to be more inclusive. And first, I want to talk about identifying the issue. So where research misses the mark. And in order to do that, we need to talk about everyone in the community being what we call a lived experience expert. Now, what is a lived experience expert? What we're trying to move away from in research was calling people in the community subject matter experts or participants or subjects. And after having conversations with the community, they decided that lived experience expert was the best title. And what this hopefully represents is just that it's your life, your experiences, and it's a way for research to better understand how it should work to benefit you. So lived experience expert is anyone in the community, anyone who has a bleeding disorder or is a family member of a bleeding disorder, anyone who is impacted by bleeding disorders. So just to show a quick visual, on the left-hand side, you'll see a wheel that doesn't have everything quite filled in. And so you'll see, from my understanding and my perspective, right now the current state of research is missing a few things. Right now we have an incomplete understanding of what it's like on a day-to-day level to live with a bleeding disorder. So I don't mean in the sense that we are missing data, clinical data, or we're missing different things. I specifically mean we do not have a comprehensive understanding of what it's like for people in the community, what it means for them to have issues to get to their HTC, issues with insurance, issues with pain every day and how it impacts their ability to go to work or provide for their family. Many researchers currently work independently of the community. So what that means is they will come up with research questions and topics on their own. And in my experience, that doesn't necessarily always reflect the needs and desires of the communities that they're trying to serve. And so on the other side, you'll see in my world what's the ideal state of research. And that is a complete understanding of what it's like to live with a bleeding disorder. Obviously, complete is never really possible, but we're going to work towards the ideal state of research so that we can get a better idea of, what everyone's going through on a day-to-day basis and what it means to live with a bleeding disorder. And in that ideal state of research, we're working with the community. Researchers are incorporating lived experience experts into their research, both not only in terms of how they're collecting data, but also in the development of manuscripts or the development of research projects and things like that. And so I hope this is driving the point home, but to bridge that gap is the most important thing is the experiences of the community. So your experiences are what will help us get towards what I believe is the ideal state of research.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Paxton Mills, and I'm going to be talking about why that lived experience expert voice is so valuable and how it is such an integral part of the overall research experience and how you can have an active role in filling those gaps that Matt identified. Next. Okay, so just to kind of frame this conversation, we know as a community that there is a disconnect, or at the very least, a perceived disconnect between the people who are doing the research and the people that the research is affecting or concerning, right? And so that can be kind of discouraging to community members who otherwise would be very interested in getting involved. When there is that disconnect and they think, is this really a place for me? Am I actually welcome at the table? These are all kinds of questions that would run through our community members' minds. So collectively, kind of as an organization, as a bleeding disorders community here, we have decided to start taking active steps towards addressing those gaps in communication between researchers and the people that the research is affecting and impacting. So the way that this is done is by actively recognizing that the best research on bleeding disorders will result from an understanding of what it's actually like to live with bleeding disorders. And that is really where you come in, the lived experience experts and the community members. So your voice helps. It's actually not just helpful, it's incredibly crucial and vital to better understanding what it's like to live with a bleeding disorder, something that not necessarily everybody who's doing research has personal experience with. So you can actually help to inform these studies and research questions. So the lived experiences in particular that are of interest are maybe ones that are more intricate or not fully encapsulated by something like a lab test, right? So these are things that maybe we're interested in or understanding, like what's being reported by women with hemophilia or by those with mild to moderate conditions or, X, Y, and Z groups. Everybody has their own unique collection of lived experiences, and that's what makes this very special. So the kinds of things that may be of interest, pain, right? What does your pain look like day to day? How would you rate that? What's your menstruation like? What was that like when you were younger, right? What was your normal? And the key there being your normal, right? What was your lived experience? Your time to diagnosis, how much time elapsed between when your first symptoms started emerging and when you actually reached an official diagnosis, or maybe you haven't. Maybe you are still undiagnosed, but having symptoms. These are all sorts of experiences that are very much valued and of interest to researchers in our community as we move forward. So the key point here too is that everybody is encouraged to participate. Diversity is incredibly important and valued in the research scene in the bleeding disorders community in the modern day. So that means, by diagnosis, by race, by ethnicity, gender, sex, all of these different metrics of diversity are crucial in forming research questions that are representative of our community as a whole and relevant to our community as a whole. So we want as many diverse voices present and participating in these conversations as possible. So in particular, that includes underrepresented groups. that includes rares, that includes the rare disorders, the platelet disorders, the rare factor deficiencies, groups that may be underrepresented in data sets historically. By participating, you can help to remedy that and ultimately change the future trajectory of the bleeding disorders community and your rare community in particular. I am someone who is a lived experience expert with the rare disorder, so that is near and dear to my heart. And I do really want to emphasize that this is the space for all in our community to have their voices heard, to participate in research, and to share those lived experiences. Next slide. So for the specific roles of the lived experience expert, they are just that, experts. The key part of that acronym is the last word, the expert part. So as a community, we have really started to center lived experience experts at the heart of our organization, our mission, all of our actions, and really our goals and our trajectory, right? We want to improve the quality of life of people who are living with bleeding disorders in the United States in particular. So lived experience experts are not just people who possess a condition that's of interest to researchers. It's not just that condition that you have that is, that is your value. Lived experience experts are actually truly active participants and valued team members in the research process. And that's really part of that ideal state of research that Matt mentioned that we're trying to work towards. So the respect that is owed to lived experience experts is coming from our acknowledgement as a community of the very real experiences and those realities faced by individuals living with bleeding disorders. And by participating as a lived experience expert and sharing your experiences, that means that you are actually playing a direct role and a direct part in shaping future research questions. So you can have an actual tangible impact in the future of bleeding disorders, care, treatment, understanding, and overall community. From the researcher's perspective, they don't necessarily know what they don't know, right? So being vocal and sharing your story is actually very impactful and very helpful for the future of our community. As a research team member mentioned on a previous webinar, the goal is to take your experience and transform it into evidence. And that really, I mean, I can't drive home that point enough, how something that seems maybe anecdotal or insignificant to you from your history living with a bleeding disorder could very much be something that maybe it's a shared experience community-wide that hasn't been recognized yet, right? Trends that maybe we haven't seen, but if more people are talking about them, they become more visible. Trends that could ultimately maybe lead to research questions and actual research being done into your experiences to hopefully improve that quality of life long term. And I think also a really interesting point, and I can speak from my own experience because I have participated in sharing my own lived experience with the bleeding disorder. By participating in research, you are inherently taking part in this holistic reflection of your journey with a bleeding disorder. So as you move through, survey questions, you kind of have to think, well, yeah, what was my normal? What was a normal period like for me, right? Or gosh, when did my first symptoms actually appear? Like you have to pause and really think and remember these things about your experience. And maybe that's been a while, right? A while since you thought about that, or a lot of time has passed since you first had symptoms, right? It forces you to engage in this holistic reflection that can make you realize things about your disorder and your journey that you hadn't really realized before. And that collectively, I think, can empower you to advocate for yourself even past when you hit submit at the end of the survey, right? By taking that information, you can then approach your practitioner, your provider, and advocate for yourself. And that all around is making for a more confident and capable community of bleeding disorders lived experience experts who are able to advocate both for themselves and for the overall community as a whole. So here we have a very stark example of how participating in research and contributing data as a group can be used to educate us about overall trends in the bleeding disorders community. So this graph is displaying the time to diagnosis. So that is the time that elapses between the onset of first symptoms and when an official diagnosis is reached. And so this graph is displaying that time to diagnosis on the basis of sex assigned at birth. So just to kind of orient you, the time to diagnosis has been divided into several different groups. So that includes being diagnosed prior to your first symptoms, at the same age, 1 year after, 2 to 5 years after, 6 to 10 years after, or over 10 years after first symptoms have appeared. So ideally, a shorter time to diagnosis is typically better for a lived experience expert and a bleeding disorders patient. When we look at this, we've circled in red some particularly interesting points that we want you to focus in on. So we have, if we start on the right-hand side, for over 10 years to reach a diagnosis, people who are female constitute a very large portion of people who are female constitute this over 10 years to diagnosis group, whereas it's about 3% of males. So the females are displayed in the orange bar and the males in the blue bar. If we look towards the left-hand side for the same age of first symptoms, again, males are in blue, we see that 54.1% of males were able to reach a diagnosis at the same age of first symptoms, while only 22.5% of females reached the diagnosis at the same age of first symptoms. So this shows us as an example that there is a very large disparity or gap in reaching a diagnosis on the basis of birth sex, right? This wouldn't necessarily have been possible if we hadn't had lived experience experts share with us how much time had elapsed between the first time you had symptoms and when you reached that official diagnosis. These bar graphs and these bars display quite how large that disparity is between males and females, and that 45% of females taking over a decade to diagnose, that's a substantial portion of that population. And so this kind of collection of data and the sharing of lived experiences can help us as a community to do some self-reflection and see, okay, why might that be? Why are we seeing this really large gap between males and females on the basis of the time to diagnosis, right? What might we be able to do as a community to remedy that and to help females get access to those diagnoses sooner and not have to wait, a decade or more to reach a diagnosis? So just a very clear and powerful example, I think, of where we are as a community and how your experiences are very much welcome and useful. I mean, this wouldn't necessarily have been something so clearly quantified if we hadn't had people share their experiences and their numbers. And collectively, this graph includes over 400 participants' data. Overall, to improve our situation as a community, we need to have a solid foundation of understanding for where we stand in the moment so that we can ultimately move forward. And this is a great example of that, I think. So next, I wanted to emphasize the point of power in the bleeding disorders community. So everybody living with a bleeding disorder, all lived experience experts, each have their own unique set of experiences, collection of, symptoms, instances interacting with the healthcare system, managing that diagnosis. And what makes you as a lived experience expert unique is that collection of experiences that nobody else has an identical set to, right? So each lived experience expert then inherently has power, right? Because of that unique experience that they have. But the key part in exercising that power and having an influence is to participate. So share your information, whether that's just having a conversation at a round table, right? In the bleeding disorders community, making new connections, meeting new people, maybe meeting someone with your same diagnosis for the first time in your life. That's something that that can be facilitated by this. Your experiences and your stories are valued, right? So have discussions, talk with your provider, participate in research, whatever that looks like for you. Sharing your experiences is where the power lies. You can help others who have faced similar challenges by sharing things which may have previously gone either unheard or unacknowledged. You can help those who do not understand to ultimately understand by sharing your experiences. And all of this can have the downstream effect of seeing yourself, seeing your disorder represented in the data, which maybe hasn't happened before, right? And there's real value in that to helping future generations and future iterations of bleeding disorders community members. And then just to close my part of this, I've included a photo here from the Bleeding Disorders Conference Ultra Rare Networking Hour. For those of you who have attended this, it is a wonderful event that boasts ample opportunity for lived experience experts to get to know one another and even meet others, like I mentioned, with the same disorder for the first time in their lives. That happened to me, one BDC. I witnessed that happen several times at this event. And I just really wanted to close with this to reiterate that all disorders, including the rares and diversity in all forms, are welcome in the bleeding disorders space, whether that's, like I mentioned, the roundtable discussions, participating in research. It's all very much an asset for us to have as many voices heard at the table and brought to the table. And so you are very much welcome to contribute your stories, your experiences, and all are very much welcome.
Thank you, Paxton, for breaking that down. I think it's, if anyone has any questions at the end, I think Paxton is a really great person to ask because I'm not part of the community, but she is, and I'm very cognizant of the difference that exists there between how I view research in the bleeding disorders community and how someone who is actually in the bleeding disorders community views research. But for this next section, we're going to talk about the how. So how you can actually participate in research, how you can make your experiences actually turn that into evidence, and how your voice can help shape research. So if there's one thing I can say, or I hope you take away from this, it's just share your voice. There are obviously a few different ways. You can become a lived experience expert. There are a few different ways you can do that. I'll be talking about community voices in research in a moment, but there are a few different avenues that you can do that you can use to participate in research and become a lived experience expert. You can influence research in many different ways, whether that be a lived experience expert or whether that just be advocating for your community. So advocating for your community means going to chapter events, going to Washington Days, writing to your politicians, just making sure that you are an advocate for your community. And so the main thing that I want to talk about in terms of how you can participate in research is through our community-powered registry, which is called Community Voices in Research. So Community Voices in Research is a community-powered registry that collects information directly from people in the bleeding disorders community, and it does that through electronic surveys online. And it asks a pretty comprehensive number of questions that cover a lot of different topics. And like I said at the beginning, the hope is to get a better, more collective understanding of what it's like to live with a bleeding disorder. So that information, that data that we collect, hopefully that can complement other research efforts in the community. So it gives us a better understanding of, like Paxton said, what it's like to have pain or how normal or abnormal your menstrual cycles are. These are all things that we can only discover and look into when we have the research. So when I say that we're trying to center research on the lived experience, the data that Paxton showed is a perfect example of that. So that data actually comes from community voices in research. And you can obviously see that there's a huge disparity between those that are diagnosed at the onset of symptoms, largely male, and 46% that are diagnosed 10 years later. Now, if you have a conversation with any women in the community, they are not surprised to hear that whatsoever. But the importance of having that data and that evidence available is, it's hard for me to overstate how crucial that is. So community voices in research is a way that we collect that information, and I'll give a breakdown of how that looks in a moment. But the last part I want to talk about for what CVR is just we're trying to make it a two-way street. So I constantly say research is a two-way street because I think it's important that we give back to the community in ways that we ask for data and experiences from the community. So we tried to make community voices in research as much of a resource and as much of a tool as possible. And I'll go through a few of those things in a bit. But we try and offer things like a personalized dashboard, the ability to see your data and how it compares to others, connecting you to educational or policy resources that are available at NBDF. And we're just trying to make sure that we can help community members become active members of the healthcare team and active members of research. So who is eligible? If you are part of the bleeding disorders community and you are an immediate or an immediate family member, you are eligible. So all diagnoses like Paxton said, whether you're ultra rare or not, we would need everyone and everyone. all sexes, all genders. The only limitation is you have to live in the United States and you have to be an adult according to certain state laws. So specifically, Alabama, Nebraska, you need to be over 19. In Mississippi, you need to be over 21. But all the other states, it's just 18. Previously, we did not have CVR in Spanish, but I'm very, very happy to say that we have now launched it in Spanish. So it is available, all of the resources, all of the questionnaires, all of the links, everything is entirely translated into Spanish because we can only get so much information from the English-speaking people who participate in CVR, but we need to get a good representative view of everyone living with bleeding disorders, and that's not exclusively people who only speak English. So how does it work? This looks a little topsy-turvy, but it works the same way you would sign up for any other website. So using a unique email address, so one for you, not for your family, not for you and your wife or husband or spouse, but just one for you. So you sign up, you answer a few questions of eligibility, and this is only to make sure that you are actually part of the community. We want to make sure that providers and researchers who are not part of the bleeding disorders community, so for example, that would be someone like myself, we want to make sure people like that do not join CVR because that is not the data that we are interested in. We only want to know about people who are in the community. So you'll verify your email, you'll set your password just like you would with anything else. We have the ability to give you two-factor authentication if you're interested. You'll review the participant agreement, just goes through how your data is protected, how your data is used, what you'll be doing, and then afterwards you can enroll and you'll get access to the dashboard, which I'll show a breakdown of what the dashboard looks like in a moment. So what we ask, there are a lot of things. I'm just going to give a quick once-over of some of the avenues and perspectives that we're trying to get when we ask these questions. So obviously we want to know about demographics, but we also want to know other social determinants of health. We want to know access to care issues. Is it you don't have an HTC in your network? Is the HTC too far? Can you not afford to get there? There's something called community counts, and community counts is great, but it only provides clinical data from HTCs. So we're trying to get information from people who receive care at HTCs and people who don't receive care at HTCs. We want to see how having a bleeding disorder impacts your mental health, how it impacts your social support, which is why if you're a family member, but you don't necessarily have a bleeding disorder, we also want to hear from you. So we'll be launching the family survey very soon, but the hope there is to get an understanding of what it's like to be a family member to someone with a bleeding disorder, because you're going through a lot of the same things, obviously not the same, but a lot of similar things in how your life has changed and how your life must adapt to the person in your life, to help the person in your life. So as you can see here, there's a lot of different avenues and different areas that we're trying to focus on. Like I said, just to get a really, truly comprehensive view and understanding of what it's like to live with a bleeding disorder. And so hopefully, like I said, we can make CVR work to serve you in the community. So whether that be through our personalized dashboard, which you can see your responses and see how they compare across the community and change over time, whether that's access to community resources, so access to trustworthy and incredible resources that NBDF has, or discover research opportunities. We're working on something called Research Connect, which will connect you not only to clinicaltrials.gov, but any other additional research opportunities, paid or not paid, that are offered to people with your diagnosis or in your demographic. And one of the most enticing parts is if you sign up for CVR and complete the baseline survey, you can win a trip to NBDF's Bleeding Disorders Conference in Aurora, Colorado later this year. So what that means is when you finish your baseline survey, you'll be entered into a raffle, and then about a month or two before BDC, 2 months before BDC, in July, we will reach out, we'll find out who wins the raffle, we'll reach out and see if you'd be interested in being flown out to beautiful Aurora, Colorado. So now I'll show a little bit of what CVR actually looks like. So this is your personalized dashboard. So this is where we break down a few of the different things that are offered to you. So at the top, you just have a few notes. On the bottom left, you have my tasks. So this is where you will find different areas and different surveys that are being offered to you. On the right, you'll have missions. So these are ways to encourage you to participate, whether that be joining, completing the baseline survey, making referrals, or inviting other people, things like that. So the baseline survey, this is just a snapshot. So it's a very straightforward survey. And there will be different sections, and each section will outline what the questions are and how you should properly answer those. Like Paxton said, a lot of this goes to hopefully make you stop a little bit and think like, okay, how did I feel last year compared to this time? How has my social support been in the last, 3, 4 months? So these are all bits of information that we really need to get that comprehensive and that collective view of what your experience is like. On the My Data side, this is a way for us to share that information back to the community. A lot of people in the community, when we were workshopping through this, were frustrated that they would participate in things but not see the end result, not see the data that comes out of it. And so what we're trying to do here is give you some of that information back. So for here, we have a question that talks about employment difficulties. And so if you wanted to see the responses for people with hemophilia A to the question, have you ever had any difficulty maintaining employment because of your bleeding disorder? When you click that on the right-hand side, it'll change and it'll show you how many people said yes or what proportion said yes, and then what proportion said no. So you can click on the different questions, and at the top there's a drop-down bar and you can choose different diagnoses to see which applies to the question. Another resource on here is a map. So this map serves to show you where you are geographically compared to the rest of the participants in CVR. So this map is a little helpful, but we're hoping is even more helpful is when you hover over a certain area. So if you hover over north, you'll get links. So you'll get links to chapters and how you can find the chapters and their websites. And then it'll also give you a list of the HTCs in that geographical region. I spoke with a mother last year who said her son got injured while on a road trip with his friends and didn't know where the nearest HTC was or the nearest chapter, had to go to just whatever the closest hospital was, and they didn't have Factor. They were very unfamiliar with what it's like to have a bleeding disorder. So hopefully this can be a resource that helps alleviate some of that stress. My educational resources, this is just a page where we can have educational resources and policy resources consolidated into an area. So you can find steps for living, you can find video information on how the body works to stop bleeding, you can find information on insurance and how you can navigate finding the correct insurance or the right insurance for you. What we're trying to do, like I said, is just make this a tool that helps benefit the community. And then the last part I'll talk about is what's called My Health Summary. And so what we're trying to do here is have a little snapshot of your experience. And the point here is to help you become a bit more of an advocate for your own care. So you can have whatever information you'd like when you go to see your provider. So if you have a provider visit with a physical therapist and you have the question in CVR that says, I've had this many joint bleeds or I've been in this much pain. Our goal is that you can have this here. On the top right, you can see you can either download or print it. And ideally, you would bring it to your physical therapist or your provider and show them, has your name, has your diagnosis, your medications, and whatever other relevant information you have. So you don't have to worry about thinking back, like how much pain was I in this week? How many joint bleeds did I have last year? Things like that. You can have an actual concrete number and be able to show them how you've been living. So just to kind of quickly wrap up, a few things. Today we talked about why bleeding disorders research needs your voice. Hopefully you understand that participating in research is the best way to give researchers a comprehensive understanding of what it's like to live with a bleeding disorder. So this is important for everyone, people who are part of ultra-rare groups, people who are part of understudied populations, people who go to HTCs, people who don't go to HTCs. We need everyone to participate in research to make sure that we have a good understanding of how people are living with bleeding disorders. So we're trying to center that on the lived experience, not how researchers expect it to be or how researchers want it to be, but how you actually live with your bleeding disorder. And hopefully you'll join CVR, which is our community-powered registry, and hopefully You'll be able to participate in a way that makes you feel like you're giving back to the community and giving back to bleeding disorders research. And so that is it for our presentation. You can use this QR code and make an impact, share your story, sign up for CVR, make sure your voice is heard. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much, Matt and Paxton, for your presentations. It's really interesting to hear about why the knowledge of lived experience experts is so important to doing good research, the power of that experience, and then to see this clear demonstration of how that power can really benefit research in the community voices in research. Just before we start our live Q&A, I want to draw your attention to the chat. There's a chat button in the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, you'll see a link to the Community Voices in Research website that I dropped in there while Matt was speaking. So you might want to copy that and save it somewhere, maybe bookmark it so that when we end the webinar, you can go back and go back to that site. So we'll go ahead now with our live Q&A. If you have a question for Matt or Paxton, very close to that chat button, you'll find the Q&A button, and you can pop your question in there, and we'll do our best to answer all of your questions. I'll ask them; they'll answer them. They're the experts. So I'll start with, and I don't know, like maybe you can either pick who wants to answer, or maybe both of you can give your answer. So if I understand this correctly, any lived experience expert with no research experience can still contribute something valuable to research. They don't need to learn any complex research concepts. They can literally just contribute what they live. Is that right?
That is correct. We have something on the horizon, a research ambassador program, where people who are lived experience experts who do not have experience in research but want to participate in research can sign up to go through a curriculum and training to learn about the protocols and good clinical practice and how research studies are conducted. So that's one avenue for people who want to participate. But for that other group that you're asking about who have no experience and don't necessarily want to participate, they are absolutely wanted, and their information is just as valuable as anyone else if they have a bleeding disorder and they're in the bleeding disorders community. So if they're a family member or loved one, we want to hear their voice.
And it might even be something that progresses, right? Like you might start out saying, okay, I'm just going to put some data in. And then, it's kind of a gateway. You can, well, this is interesting. Maybe I can get involved a little more. Then maybe if I can go to the other extreme, if you're, a bit of a nerd like me and you really love research or you love biochemistry and molecular biology, and you have a bleeding disorder, are there opportunities to get involved in research as a healthcare professional or a scientist? And is there something particularly potentially rewarding about getting involved in research in that way as someone with a disorder?
I'll jump in here. Yes, so I do think it's very interesting as someone who's got the intersecting, roles and spheres of my life as a lived experience expert with a bleeding disorder and aspiring hematologist, provider who treats and also researches blood and bleeding disorders. I recently spoke to a hematologist, just for like career advice, and she was telling me how unique it is and how special it is when someone embarks on a career path or a journey who has an inherent understanding of, whatever disorder they're going to be treating or interested in specializing in. I find that I'm particularly interested in it, right? Because it's what I've known for a while, right? Since I've lived it. And I think that can likely only help because you would be in the unique position, of having not just I hear you, like I hear the words that you're saying, but I truly understand, right? I understand you because I understand that I've lived it as well. And that's not to say everybody has the same experiences living with a bleeding disorder. By no means is that the case. But I think you also kind of get a sense for what matters in the community, right? And what matters are addressing those disparities that we talked about, right? Like the fact that it takes people who are female so much longer typically to be diagnosed in the bleeding disorders community than those who are male. That graph that I talked about, right? So it helps to kind of, I guess, contextualize the value of this, that there are real people behind this. This is not merely, a test tube with somebody's labs, that was drawn, somebody's blood sample or whatever. It's not merely someone it's not a statistic, right? It's not patient A with this disorder. There are real people behind it. We see also the community side of things, the incredible support network that the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation provides, how impactful it is when those connections are made at BDC, right? So it's definitely an interesting experience to have both of those going on simultaneously. Yeah.
Great, thank you. It's so great to have your perspective on that because I think it's not unique. You're not the only one, but it's not so common. And it does sound like a really rewarding combination. Quite the opposite of, and I know everybody knows that this attitude is out there. I heard a doctor once say, "Oh yeah, we can involve the patients, we can have their input. They're not going to tell us anything we don't already know." So I think it's really exciting to see that maybe that mentality is starting to become a little more passé, and we're starting to really recognize the value that's there. Maybe we can ask some questions really more specifically about the CVR and the data collection and how it lives, where it lives. I think, a question that a lot of people would want to know is how safe is my data? How is it protected? Where does it live and how do you keep it safe?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So CVR has been reviewed by the Institutional Review Board, so IRB approval. We have the Certificate of Confidentiality from the NIH, but more importantly, NBDF staff does not have access to that information. So it is hosted in top-of-the-line encryption on the back end through the website that hosts CVR. And so anyone who works at NBDF does not have access to it. Data is encrypted where it's stored. It's encrypted when it is transmitted to the patient or from the patient. And that's why we have all those security features like the two-factor authentication, signing up with a unique email address, things like that to make sure that your data is as safe as possible from anyone else or even anything identifiable from our end.
And what if I join and I fill in my data and then a couple of months later I kind of feel like, nah, I don't want to do this anymore. Is there a way to withdraw? Or is it just like in there forever?
There is a way to withdraw, so there are a few different things. If you want to remove your data, you can contact us and remove your data. We'll delete it from everything that we have. And then if you just want to stop receiving the emails because you're happy to give us the information and the data that you have, then we can also accommodate that. That way we can make sure that people, if they don't want to receive the emails anymore, they don't have to. But if you want to change anything, you can change something. Or if you just want to be removed entirely, you can be removed entirely.
And would you say there's value, even if all I ever do is fill out the baseline data? Like, do I have to feel like I need to fill out every single update for it to have value? Or is there value if I just fill it out at least that first time?
If you just fill it out that first time, I think that is the most important part. So soon we'll be launching the annual survey where we'll ask many of the same questions from the baseline survey a year later, and hopefully we can get a better idea of how people's lives are changing, either their pain levels or any other question that we ask, how it's changing over time from year to year. So at the very least, participating and doing the baseline survey still gives us more information than if someone didn't participate.
Right. And very important, can I do it on my phone?
You can do it on your phone. It is a website. We do not have an app for it right now, but it is accessible on your phone and you can still complete everything just as you would on a desktop computer.
Okay, cool. And then, so let's say I want to use the My Health Summary to chat with my healthcare professional about something. I could pull that up on my phone as well, or do I need to like download and print that in advance of meeting with my healthcare provider?
You can do either one. If you want to print it out, we have the method in the top right for you to print it out. If you'd like to just save it and keep it on your phone, we can do that as well. The goal there is to kind of make it as easy as possible for whoever is bringing it to their provider.
Maybe can you talk just a little bit more about how that might be a useful thing to take into a discussion with a provider? Like how can you kind of use that information to help manage your own disorder, your own day-to-day management of that disorder?
Yeah, so the best example that I usually use is one with a physical therapist. So we ask questions about your pain, how your pain is impacting your ability to work, how your pain is impacting your ability to live, how how many joint bleeds you've had. All of these questions impact the way that your physical therapist can get a better understanding of how much is being taken away from you and your happiness and your ability to live your life through the pain and through the disorder. So that's one avenue. We also, since we ask questions about barriers to care, if you are seeing a social worker, you can really bring that and use that to highlight, I don't have enough resources to get me to the HTC, or I don't have enough money in my bank account to pay the out-of-pocket or copay expense. And so there are a few different ways you can use it, and hopefully there are enough ways to allow pretty much everyone to use it in any capacity that they would like.
Maybe a question from the point of view of somebody who is doing research or interested in doing research. Is there a way, if I have a great question as a healthcare provider who wants to do a study, or a scientist, is there a way to query the data that the CVR has? Who would I talk to? Who would I bring my idea to?
So you can either contact myself or Maria Santaella, who is the VP of Research, and you can reach out to us. We are more than happy to have a conversation about what data we share. All data that's shared is only shared in aggregate de-identified manners. So no names are used, nothing that is identifiable, only large groupings. And even for people with ultra rares, if there is a really small number of individuals and there is even a chance that it could be identified, then we will loop that or group that into a larger category when we're sharing that information.
Right, that makes sense. So they're not going to tell someone that they've got the data of the only person with this particular disorder in this state, because everyone will know that's me anyway, right?
Exactly. That's what we're trying to avoid.
Okay, makes sense. And what if, I know you mentioned that there's a resource of other sort of research opportunities. What if I've got a trial I'm running right now, I'm recruiting for? Maybe I'm a pharma company or an institute, and I'd like to, find those other Factor 13 deficient people out there who might be interested in participating in my study. How can I maybe get you to list that and make your community aware of that?
I would say reach out to us, cvr@bleeding.org, or my email. We are more than happy to, once we launch the Research Connect tool, we're more than happy to have everyone that is looking for participants to be listed on that tool. It's valuable not only for industry, it's valuable for people who want to participate in research, it's valuable for people who want to write papers and people who want that data.
Right. And speaking of papers, so I know you've got some publications from your work. Is there a way to access those, or how can we find out what you've been working on?
So like I said earlier, when we were having conversations with the community before, and they were really like, we want to make sure we see the data, we really heard that. And so we made a section on the dashboard where you can click and see the data that has been published through CVR. So you can see what publications have used your data or your information, your voice, to produce and identify different aspects of research.
That's great. Okay. And I got a couple of links that have just popped into the chat there. One is directly to a very recent paper that's come out about CVR, and then there's another one that's a whole list of research papers that people can look up. So getting some help in the back end here to pop some links in for everybody. So hopefully people will have a look again in the chat and see those links and go and check out those papers. I thought it was really interesting too, what you're saying about the resources that are associated with like the chapter and HTC directories and the educational resources. Do I have to contribute my data to CVR to have access to those?
You have to register in order to have access to those, but after you register, you can access it without completing the baseline survey. I highly encourage you to participate in the baseline survey because data is important, your voice is important, but also because you can win a trip to BDC. But yes, you can still access all of those resources without necessarily completing the baseline survey.
Right. It's a really great resource, and there's so many interesting resources there, and then also so much potential with the data, and it's really great to see that it's also being shared so broadly through the publications. So that's an exciting thing to see happening. I wanted to ask, and this may be an unfair question to put you on the spot, but do you know how many different diagnoses are represented in CVR at the moment?
I do not have it off the top of my head, but I know it's pretty comprehensive. Admittedly, there is always a desire and need for, like Paxton and I have been saying, ultra rares. I think as much representation as we can get of the ultra rares, the better. But at the moment, we have a pretty widespread amount of diagnosis, but definitely would love to have a higher concentration of as many people as possible.
So maybe I can bounce that to you, Paxton. As a person with a bleeding disorder, living with a rare disorder, why would you get involved in this? Why would you contribute your data to this, and why should somebody else?
Yeah, so for me, the why was let's see, I was diagnosed maybe around age 12 or 13. And I remember when I was first diagnosed, kind of, with my mom trying to learn about it and learn about this condition and not seeing very much about it published online. There not being a whole lot of accessible information about that disorder. And then becoming involved in the community many years after that. And finally, like seeing that, you know what I mean? And seeing, for instance, the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation emerging with that monumental name change, right? These active efforts that have been taken to be more inclusive, that has been particularly, moving to me as a lived experience expert. But for me, the why for participating in research is because I had like, that wasn't a long time ago when I was diagnosed. The fact that we were in the age that we're in with, science and technology and research and medicine, and I wasn't really able to find a whole lot on what I had and couldn't find very many support networks and services, I guess, and just all around a lack of information online about what this disorder means when you're new and you don't really know, okay, what does this look like for me as I, progress through life stages? What are treatments like? How serious is it? How prevalent is it, right? Like one in how many, right? Like I couldn't find any sort of estimate, honestly, until like, I think it was last month, I finally found something that kind of gave an idea of how many people have it, right? So for me, it was that experience of being in this kind of information void with my disorder, and then hoping and desiring to be a part of filling that and making information more accessible. And, if my data that I've submitted to CVR is one of however many who have my disorder, then that's one more than you would have had if I hadn't, shared my story and shared my experiences. And that can only help, right? Maybe there's, like I said, maybe there's a shared experience of people with my disorder that hasn't been recognized really yet by science. And maybe that's something real and meaningful that should be investigated. But we'll never know those things unless, unless people who are willing and able do end up sharing their stories.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best way that can possibly be expressed. I think you really hit the nail on the head. This is a fantastic community resource that's built by the community for the community, and it's benefiting the community. So thank you so much for putting that so eloquently. I think we'll leave it there. I think that's a fantastic place to stop today. I really want to thank Paxton Mills and Matt Hartnett for sharing your passion for research with us today and your expertise. And I also want to thank everybody who's joined us online. We really appreciate your attendance today. This recorded webinar will be available shortly after the webinar on bleeding.org under the events tab. If you select past events, you can find all of the archived webinars there. Also available in that events tab is the schedule of upcoming webinars. Join us next week when Dr. Amy Shapiro will tell us about recombinant factor IX Fc efficacy and outcome data. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.